Let's start with talking about what's going on in Greece briefly right now,
Right.
especially with the default and all that.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, as you know, there are negotiations going on between the Greek government and the European Union on the so-called haircut of the crisis. But everyone knows that even if an agreement is reached within the next days, actually, the concrete implementation of that agreement will be highly problematic. That's the first point. And secondly, even if it is implemented, it is totally insufficient to provide a viable solution, actually, to the debt crisis in Greece. So everyone expects at some stage Greece to default. And the only real question are about the conditions of that default. So roughly speaking, there are two possibilities. The one is the so-called creditor-led default, which means that it will be imposed by the lenders, essentially the European Union and the IMF. And this will be at the expense, of course, of the country and of the people, because the counterpart to this will be an even harder package of austerity measures, which have already brought the country down to its knees. I mean, and the economy, and have, they have provoked a kind of 1930s type of recession. The second option would be a default led by the country itself, so by its government, under, of course, the pressure of the people and of popular movements. And this would mean that Greece would follow the path initiated by other governments. I mean, even in the recent past, like Ecuador with Correa, or Argentina before with Kirchner. And these countries took the initiative to default and renegotiate their sovereign debt on that basis, and then write off, the major part of that, most of that debt, and therefore provide a viable solution. But in order to do that, of course, a whole set of political and social conditions need to be met. This is going to be feasible only if the balance of forces shifts decisively in favor of the popular forces.
So the first option is really painful. The second option is painful, but there's a future to it that people can at least come out of the recessions or the debacles that they're in. What are the options of people on the ground? Like, talks about the opposition on the ground about what's going on.
Right. So there has been a lot going on the ground since a year and a half, when the sovereign debt crisis started, properly speaking, with the so-called memorandum signed between the Greek government and the European Union and the IMF. So a lot of movements, a lot of protests, a lot of general strikes, and we can say they have culminated last October and actually brought down the former government of Papandreou, actually. So these policies are seen as completely illegitimate and as completely disastrous. I mean, because they can't even provide a solution for supposedly what they were designed for. I mean, so the sovereign debt problem. On the contrary, with the economic recession, the sovereign debt becomes even more heavy and impossible, actually, to finance. On the other side, the recession bites very hard. Unemployment is skyrocketing. People have lost a huge part of their income. Businesses have closed down quite massively. It's really economic disaster. It's a 1930s type of situation. I mean, things are very, very very hard. It's unprecedented by Western European standards. So, what are the options? The options for the moment are that the popular resistance has to face a difficult situation due to a lack of a political alternative, right? I think that's the crucial thing. A political alternative would mean an agenda starting from default and then continuing, and this is of course the difficulty of the situation, with exiting the Eurozone. I mean, that's the specificity of the Greek situation compared to the Latin American one, let's say. In the Latin American situation, you could say, okay, we are defaulting and we are, we have our national currency, or we break the parity between the peso and the dollar, as was the case in Argentina, and we go ahead and renegotiate the debt, and we provide something which is socially viable somehow. But in Greece, in order to default, actually, you have to counter the European Union as such. And the European Union is not a simple thing, to confront with, right? It's a powerful capitalist institution, absolutely decided to defend the interests of banks, of the financial sector, of the people who hold not only, the Greek debt, actually the bonds of the Greek debt, but who hold in general, the sovereign debt, of the other countries. So this is Greece as such is a small country. Its sovereign debt is a small part of that, ocean actually of sovereign debt. Behind this, you have the whole financial system, okay? So the stakes, therefore, are very, very high. And what the European Union and the financiers are afraid of is that, Greece could give some kind of bad example, because if Greece defaults and puts forward a progressive alternative, then obviously there will be a domino effect and other countries will be very much tempted to go down that route as well.
So, as you mentioned last night, the Greek society is a very resistant society, especially since the fall of the military junta rules. And can you talk about the KKE, the socialist parties and all this, what are they doing? Since you're saying it could, if the Greece default, then it sets up actually a good example for
right.
the rest of the nations
okay.
to go for. But can you talk about now on the ground
right.
what those progressive
okay.
organizations and parties
okay.
do?
Right. Okay. So to cut a long story short, the Greek Socialist Party, which has ruled the country most of the time since the early 1980s, actually, has completely lost its socialist roots and has transformed itself the way other actually European social democratic parties have turned into a kind of neoliberal party, completely managing the system. And they won the elections in 2009 with a very strong mandate of precisely not imposing austerity, and they ended up by imposing the worst type of austerity the country has ever seen. So as a result of that, the PASOK, the Socialist Party, has disintegrated and is now in shambles, actually. Currently, opinion polls give to the socialists barely more than 12 or 14%, actually, whereas they got 44% just 3 years ago. So that's for the center-left. Now, one of the specificities of Greece is that the left, which is to the left of the Socialist Party, is quite strong. But it is fragmented. It is divided between two major forces. The one is the traditional Communist Party of Greece, which is the largest force actually to the left of the socialists. It's a party with strong ties with the workers' movement and the youth. It's combative, but it's also very sectarian and very much nostalgic somehow of the former Soviet Union. It's even a party that has fully rehabilitated Stalin in the last years, actually. And the reason I think they are doing this is that they conceive the party as a name per se, in itself. They conceive it as a kind of stronghold which has to be defended at any cost, and they refuse any form of unity and even common action with other forces on the left, actually. And this, of course, is a very, very serious obstacle to the development of the struggle. Now, the other major force on the Greek radical left is the Coalition of the Radical Left, which is an umbrella of several organizations. Most of them, and the most important one, which is called Synaspismos, the Coalition of the Left, also come from various splits of the Communist Party. They have a much more open and unitary approach, much more united front, let's say, type of approach. The problem is that, all their proposals for some kind of unity are met with total hostility by the Communist Party, and this is of course very negative. But the major weakness, and this is I think a weakness which is common to these two forces actually, both the Communist Party and the coalition of the radical left, is that although they are relatively strong in electoral terms, in terms of organization, in terms of the impact they have in Greek society, they are politically very weak in their capacity to put forward a proper alternative. It is as if they are afraid actually of saying, yes, we can provide a solution to this crisis. And yes, we are serious candidates, to take power and to provide solution for the people and for the country. Somehow, they still want to operate the way they operated before, in the last period. So, building a resistance, waging social battles, etc., but not considering the issue of power, properly speaking. But in Greece, you see, the gravity of the crisis is such, the ruling class and its political elite, are so discredited and so weakened by what's happening that inevitably any type of alternative poses in a concrete way the question of power, okay? Not as an immediate transition to, some kind of ideal socialism, etc., but as a capacity to provide concrete but radical alternatives to the current situation and the current crisis.
So can we bring an example of Iceland into this situation? What do you think if Greece defaults like Iceland did? Would the suffrage would be the same, different? Would Greeks do better in the long term?
Well, the problem with Greece is that it's not only about the banks, right? The default in Iceland was essentially about sorting out what Icelandic banks owed actually to English banks and other banks. In Greece, the problem is much deeper because it has to do with the Greek state as such, okay, and with a memorandum agreed, initially by the Greek state and the European Union, etc. So Greece is at the very center of the European crisis, okay? This is why it is a kind of laboratory where the ruling classes want to implement this kind of salvage, okay, measures and punish somehow the country in order to, manage the crisis at their benefit on a larger scale, okay? So the battle, in Greece is only part or is the most advanced, let's say, front of a much broader battle. This means that it will be very, very tough, okay? The confrontation will be very, very tough, and any choice, any kind of progressive alternative will certainly have a cost. But I think also that, Greece has a very good cards, to play in that. Defaulting is a very strong card. You take the initiative and you shift the balance of forces in your own benefit. You can therefore renegotiate and open up new possibilities.
So may I ask you, and correct me on this one, please. Do you think the capitalist democracy is dying or it's dead? In a sense, the democratic institutions, as in U.S. and Europe, are being taken out of the equation now.
Totally. Greece. In Greece, there is a kind of massive denial of any sort of democracy. Even within the kind of limited framework of parliamentary institutions and representative democracy, even that is now, completely destroyed, or considered as outdated. The policies that have been implemented have absolutely no democratic legitimacy. They are clearly imposed on the country in a kind of neo-colonial way, and in this case, the colonial power is the European Union, which acts in an absolutely abruptly, bluntly, overtly neo-colonial way, with, of course, the full support of the Greek ruling class, of course. That's absolutely clear. We have seen that when, in a kind of act of despair, the former Greek Prime Minister proposed a referendum on the conditions of the agreement of October 26th, an agreement on the European level at the European Summit in Brussels. And the European leaders said, no, you don't have the right to ask, your own people what they think about, what has been agreed. I mean, that was a very clear sign that democracy is absolutely incompatible with this type of policies. And more broadly, I think I agree with you. I think that capitalism and democracy is a kind of contradiction in terms. But for some decades after World War II, there was the so-called welfare state and a certain type of social compromise which somehow, softened the angles and made a certain form of, coexistence possible between capitalism, but, attenuated and with some kind of counterweight, and forms of democratic participation and democratic procedures. But now neoliberalism has destroyed all this. And the Soviet Union is not there anymore to act as a kind of counterweight to capitalist domination on an international scale. So the dominant classes feel they have, nothing to be afraid of anymore. And they act, in order to destroy every social and democratic conquest that has been very, very, hardly won by the workers' movements and by the popular movements since more than a century.
See, I'm pretty sure you know this, that the word socialism in the United States is very negative. In Europe, it's very positive. So would it be an alternative to that we start talking about the social democracy with limitation to capital and capitalism? Would that be the alternative that we need to focus on?
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, of course, we need to redefine what we understand by socialism after the failure of the so-called real existing socialism, okay? The lessons from that experience need to be, very seriously discussed and clarified by all the progressive forces. I mean, we know that a certain number of things were clearly wrong, and this was the reason of that failure. Not everything was negative, of course. There were, I think, also positive aspects and dimensions in all this, but clearly somehow there was a kind of degeneration of those regimes. What we have to do now is, as I said, link concrete alternatives and proposals giving concrete solutions to the problems now, okay? And the major problem now is, the crisis of that system and the consequences of that crisis in the life of, the overwhelming majority of the population. We obviously need somehow to reinvent democracy to make it something, real, something meaningful. And in order to do that, we have to confront and limit the power of capital. And this is a start of a process which can lead to the overcoming of the capitalist system itself, I think.
I know I haven't asked all the questions that you wanted to answer, but if you'd like to add anything, any remarks that you would like to make, please do.
Well, the only thing I would like to add is I've read that after the Republicans accused Obama of being a socialist, there were some kind of millions of hits of the word socialism in Wikipedia, all of them coming from the US, or nearly all of them coming from the US. So I think that, the Republicans have done a marvelous job in favor of socialism in this country. And, given what the Republicans are, it was a good service, I think, for the progressive cause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.